Today we're going to be having a look at a security camera, which is a really quite capable camera, and the reason that it's not on my desk to show you is because it's earned a permanent place in my home security setup. The camera I'm talking about is the Reolink Duo 3, which is a 4K camera with two 8 megapixel lenses so that you get a full 180 degree field of view. Normally cameras with a larger viewing angle compromise on quality, but because it is basically two 4K cameras stitched together, you can see that the picture quality really is quite good. Now you might be wondering why I'm talking about this camera now, because this PoE camera has actually been out for about a year already. Well, it's because Reolink is releasing a Wi-Fi version of this camera, which is very similar to the PoE version, but it means of course that you don't need an Ethernet cable, but of course you will still need 12 volt power to power it. Before I get into more of the details, Reolink sent me this camera to test, but as always there's no input into the video and I'll tell you what's good and what's not so good. Thankfully with this camera there aren't really many bad things to talk about, so let's dive in. One of the things I like about this camera is that it has both infrared LEDs and a bright spotlight. That means that you get a normal black and white picture at night time, but as soon as motion is detected, then the spotlights come on and they're bright enough to give you a good quality colour picture, even late at night. I recently reviewed Reolink's CX810 camera, which is able to give a colour picture even in really low light at night time, which is great. But because it doesn't include infrared LEDs, if it's really dark, then you need to have its spotlight on all night for motion detection to work properly, which I'm not very keen on. So after using the Duo 3 for a while, I'm starting to think that black and white vision at night time for detecting motion, with a spotlight to record colour motion, is currently the best option. Each camera lens has a focal length of 2.8mm and an aperture of f1.6, which helps it give a decent nighttime picture quality of 4K. The two cameras are stitched together in software, and so sometimes you can see a seam when walking across the middle of the frame, but they have given some settings in the app that you can have a play with to help improve this. I've not adjusted these because I want you to see how the experience is out of the box. As with all Reolink cameras, they are privacy focused, and so you don't have to depend on a cloud connection for them to work. This applies to both the camera and to the app, which can work without an internet connection. The camera has a micro SD card slot which supports up to 256 gigabytes and has the popular communication protocols such as RTSP and ONVIF for streaming and recording your footage. Once you've enabled these in the settings, then you can connect it up to a local NVR such as Blue Iris, the Reolink NVR if you've got one of those, or these days even Unify Protect. In terms of installation, it's fairly straightforward. In the box you've got some instructions, the mounting bracket with some screws, and some glands for making the Ethernet connection watertight. You just need to screw the metal bracket to the wall, secure the plastic arm with the bracket with one screw, and then attach the camera to the plastic arm with one more screw. The bit that is a bit inconvenient is the size of the Ethernet connector. If you want it to go inside your building, then you're going to have to drill a fairly big hole. Otherwise, you'll have to just leave the connector outside instead. I mean, it is quite common to see this type of fitting for outdoor security cameras, but personally, I would prefer if they just had a waterproof RJ45 socket on the camera itself, kind of similar to how Unify does for their outdoor access points. Now it's installed, let's talk about a few more of the features. I already mentioned the camera specs and its spotlight, but it's also worth noting that it's got both a siren to scare off potential intruders and a microphone for recording the audio as well as the video. And you'll get to hear the audio quality a bit later on in the video. The other important feature of the camera is that it has person, vehicle and animal detection. I only really use the person detection, but I have found it to be more than acceptable. As with all of these sort of AI type features though, it's not perfect, and I have had a couple of times where it's falsely detected a person being there when there hasn't been a person there, and it not detecting me when I have been there. I've had more false positives with the animal detection at night time though, particularly when it's windy and things in the garden are blowing around a bit. You can also adjust the settings here though and actually change the sensitivity of these different types of motion events, so it might be worth having a look at that and playing around with it. I've just left it on 60 at the moment. Many of my older cameras don't have these AI features, and so I use the Code Source AI application to detect people. But I now really consider this as an essential feature for when choosing a camera, because it makes things nice and simple and means you don't have to record a lot of unnecessary footage when nothing is happening. In the Reolink app, you can choose whether to record continuously or just motion events, and you can set a schedule for the different hours of the day when these schedules are active. For the motion recording, it also lets you choose whether it records all motion events or just specific events such as detecting a person. This is really handy because if you've got, say, a 256GB SD card, then if you only record person events, then you could probably record days or even weeks of activity before it overwrites the old footage. Of course, you shouldn't just depend on storing footage on the camera itself though, and so the best option is to have a dedicated NVR. But if you don't want to invest in one just yet, and you are technical enough to set up your own FTP server, then you can configure it to upload your footage there as a backup to the SD card. If you don't want all of the technical setup, and you're happy to have the footage stored in the cloud, then Reolink does offer cloud storage, but there is a monthly cost attached to that. For me though, one of the big selling points of Reolink cameras is that, as well as them being decent cameras and at a good price, they give you a lot of options for storing your footage locally. The camera also has a time-lapse feature which I haven't tried to be honest, and it has an interesting feature called motion track. So motion track is a post-processing step that can be applied when you export the recording. You just need to click the squiggle in the top right when exporting a clip, and then it'll analyse the footage to give you a snapshot which is kind of an amalgamation of what happened in the clip. It does take a few minutes to process though, so I'm not sure if I'll actually use this because I could have just watched the whole clip in that time that it took to generate it. But it's still a cool feature. Now let's take a look at some of the footage that the camera captured. Hello, can you hear me? The delay is quite minimal. So this is some writing from approximately 1 meter, 2 meters, 3 meters, 4 meters, 5 meters, 6 meters, 7 meters, I also did some nighttime testing with a fake number plate sign, but as you can see, both with infrared lights in black and white mode and with the spotlights on in colour mode, it just reflects back off the sign. But the clarity of the rest of the picture is really good, even at around 9 meters away. The final thing I want to mention is that if you are a Home Assistant user, then the Reolink integration is really good. You can view footage in different qualities, you can change a couple of the camera settings without having to go back into the Reolink app, and you can activate the Siren or the Spotlight. I use the Home Assistant heading card next to my camera feed on my dashboard, which gives it some nice buttons for activating the Siren or the floodlight. I haven't gone through all of the settings that are available in the Reolink app though, because there are just so many of them, and it also depends on your specific usage, but there are various options to allow you to change things like the brightness of the image or shadows if you're not getting the quality that you're expecting. Now let's address some of the perceived negatives of this camera. So for this I decided to look through the 1 and 2 star reviews on Amazon UK. On Amazon it shows an average of 4.1 stars with 78% of reviews giving it 4 or 5 stars. Having looked through the negative reviews, I generally disagree with them, or my experience has been different. So firstly, the vertical field of view is mentioned a couple of times. But I don't think it's that bad at all. The two camera lenses are horizontally next to each other, which creates a very panoramic picture, and this can give the perception of it not showing much vertically. But I think actually it's much more about the placement of the camera, because a lot of people place their cameras too high, meaning that it just points down and you're looking at people's heads rather than actually seeing their bodies and their faces. My camera is mounted a bit too low at the moment whilst I was doing the testing, but if you look at my image, then you can see both the sky and the ground just a couple of meters away from the camera, which I think is pretty decent. Also, some people just have unrealistic expectations really. They expect the cameras to have a wild field of view, excellent video quality, both close up and far away, both at daytime and nighttime. And in my opinion, the main purpose of this camera is to be a perimeter camera which covers a wide area of your property, especially as it's got that 180-degree field of view. But then this should really be supplemented by other specific cameras such as doorbell cameras to cover certain areas where you want to have like a person identification or even maybe face identification. This is why so many different types of cameras actually exist, because there just isn't one size that fits all. A couple of reviews said that their camera stopped working, which of course isn't great, and for me time will tell on this really, because I've only had these Reolink cameras for a few months. The longest one I've had is the Reolink E1, which I've had for quite a few years, but that's just an indoor camera, so it's not exposed to the elements outside. So I'll leave a pinned comment if it changes for me, but so far I've been really impressed with the build quality and its functionality. One of the reviews mentioned that it doesn't work with the Reolink's older 2020 MVR model, so I think this is definitely worth noting if you've got one of these already and thinking of buying this camera. Other negatives seem to be more around the setup and all of its settings, and I don't really blame Reolink for this because I think that the initial setup process is very straightforward, and what gets more complex is when you integrate it with other systems or things like enabling RTSP. This is just the nature of having so much functionality available, and I really see this as a positive. If you do want something truly plug and play, then you're probably better off just going with something like Ring, giving them your money each month, and you've got a fairly simple hands-off experience. Well, let me know in the comments what you think of this camera, and thanks until next time.